Okay, thank you so much for those introductions. I'm going to go ahead and start by introducing myself. So Denisa James and I are here representing Invisible Combat. My name is Kimberly Shudo Bailey, and I am a U.S. Army veteran, and I'm also a graduate from USC School of Social Work. I'm currently working as a civil rights officer and diversity and inclusion trainer for the Department of Transportation, but I'm also the CEO and founder of Invisible Combat, which is a veteran mental health and wellness advocacy group that specializes in female veterans. Our mission is basically to promote mental health and wellness by bringing awareness to current and emerging mental health issues within the active duty and veteran community. And I'll go ahead and allow Denisa to introduce herself.
Hi, so I'm Denitza. I go by D. James. I'm a current graduate student at the School of Social Work. I'm in the Social Change and Innovation track with military focus. I'm due to graduate in May, so fingers crossed all goes well. I'll hopefully be graduated in May. I am also the Chief Operating Officer for Invisible Combat, and I'm also an Army veteran. And I put it in the chat earlier, but I'm joining you guys from Williamsburg, Virginia, and it's 10:30 p.m. over here. So thank you so much for joining us. I'm really excited to do this training and to collaborate with the military caucus and just meet you all in here. I'm gonna hand it off to Zanita.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Zanita Galino. I am an LCSW in the state of Utah. I graduated from Columbia University School of Social Work in 2009 with the clinical track. I'm really honored to be here tonight and share some experiences and some insights on grief in the military.
And with that, we're gonna go ahead and jump right on to our first slide, which is our overview and what we're gonna cover tonight. So we're between Sunita, Kim, and I, we're gonna cover what is grief, types and symptoms of grief, coping with grief during a pandemic, clinical interventions, and cultural considerations when working with veterans. In case any of you are going to work with veterans, or if you're here as a survivor, you know, we're going to cover some of the things that may affect grief in the military community. Our objectives are going to be to understand grief as a broad concept, the differences between grief versus mourning, grief support, and we're going to review some clinical interventions for clients experiencing grief. And also to better understand how veterans process grief and how it can manifest in different ways to the military community, and to understand the importance of military cultural competence, you know, when you're working with veterans. And we do want to make a disclaimer. It is a grief trainer webinar, so we may talk about some things that may spike some grief of your own and some feelings, and that's completely okay. If you need to turn your camera off or you know, take a minute, we're not going to kick you out. We're going to be here, and just let us know, let any of us know in the chat if you need to go into a waiting room or something. Okay. I'll hand it off to Sunita.
Thank you, Dee. I would like to start with a quote, The Definition of Grief by Dr. Alan Wolfelt. For anybody watching that has desire to serve people that are grieving, I highly recommend any of the trainings by Dr. Wolfelt. He's out of Fort Collins, Colorado, and he really looks at grief from not a medical model, not like it's something to treat like a disease. He says even, like, grief is not a disease. Instead, it's normal, healthy process of embracing the mystery of the death of someone loved. His angle to come at it is what he calls companioning, which is really resonates well with the social work model of meeting people where they are and kind of walking alongside with them, because people, we know they're the experts on themselves. You can switch. Thank you. Bereavement, grief, and mourning. I like to talk about what the difference is, because sometimes we throw these interchangeably. When we're bereaved, if somebody is bereft, we're talking about they're grieving the death of a person. So it's an actual person. But we know when we have had life transitions, for those that have served in the military and then transitioned to civilian life, when you've PCS someplace and then you get your community and then you leave again, we experience grief in those moments. It's not for somebody that has died. It's for an opportunity we once had, or a life we were used to, or often like what can never be. And when we talk about mourning in the field of grief and loss, it is when we take that grief outside of ourselves and we express it in some way. It doesn't have to be a speaking about the death of our loved one and how that might be difficult. Mourning can be, I'm writing in my journal about it. Mourning can be, I'm doing some art projects about my pain, my grief, the person I loved. It's just the act of taking what's happening on the inside, which is known as the grief, and then we put it on the outside, and that's mourning. Okay, so types and symptoms of grief. We thought this was really important to go over because we can hear like Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and be told that there are 6 stages of grief, and perhaps we go through them in a linear fashion. And once we get through anger, we're not going to go through anger again. But those that are familiar with her work and are familiar with grieving in our own experience, or from walking people through that journey, we know that it's absolutely not a linear process. Not only can we feel all the feels again and again, but we can feel them all on the same day. It is not an orderly process. It's definitely something that we can't go around. We can't speed through it. It's just going to take as long as it's going to take. We see themes. Those that work in grief and loss, we see themes of what comes up pretty consistently for people so that we can look at it and say what they're going through is normative grief. It's a natural process. It's what we go through, all of us. It just kind of looks different on different people. The way adolescents may express is going to look a lot like they already do, where they're going to pull away a little bit. And it can be hard to think, oh, they don't seem to be grieving. They're on their phone a lot. They're always on their phone a lot. They're pulling away. They're more grouchy. Teenagers can often be pulling away and be grouchy. So it's important to really look at that. If you're in a home where a teenager, if you're grieving and a teenager is also in the home, or you know that they have lost somebody significant or a situation that was dear to them, it's really important that we meet our clients, meet our friends, meet our family where they are. And with children, you know, they're naturally going to work things out through play. They're going to want to talk about the themes of maybe what happened. They'll play funeral. They'll play, you know, different things to help them make sense. So I say definitely we want to be honest with the children, with the adolescents in our life, meet them at age-appropriate ways. But those who work with children and have children, you know that their sense of imagination is really strong. And so if you don't tell them what really has happened, they'll make up their own thing. And oftentimes it's much more scary than just telling them the truth of what happened. Complicated mourning is what we say is like when we get stuck in that grief. People can face complicated mourning when they're grieving a death that was traumatic, when they lost a loved one to suicide, when they are witness to the aftermath of a death, which a lot of our veterans face, right? And people that are actively serving. So those can become more complicated. If you list up the symptoms of PTSD and complicated mourning, almost all of them match up except for like 1 or 2. So the symptoms are very much the same as post-traumatic stress when we have complicated mourning. This is something to look at in the clients that you're working with or in your own life. If you are facing a loss and you realize, oh my gosh, this is reminding me a lot of when I was 10 years old and I never processed the death of my grandma or my brother, for example, that's going to be really important that you get some good skilled support to work through that in a really healthy way. I like to talk about the physical symptoms because, again, that's what we look at as clinicians. We don't look at, oh, they're going through these stages, so they're here and they're this stage. This is what means about their grief journey. What we look for more is like feelings around anger, agitation, and people can have difficulty concentrating, remembering things, increased or decreased dreams. Like some of my clients never had vivid dreams, and on the other side of a death of someone they loved, they have extremely vivid dreams. And for people that haven't experienced their dreams before, it can be really disheartening. And we know that sleep is precious. And when our sleep is disturbed, it makes everything else that we're going through that is difficult more amplified. We can just feel different, especially on the tail of a traumatic loss. And it doesn't even have to really be traumatic. We could have been anticipating it. We could have done pre-mourning for somebody that, you know, could be facing hospice care. And some of the natural feelings we can have there is some people can feel relief and then they follow up with regret. Oh my gosh, what does that say about me that I have relief that my loved one has died? I think it's just important to know that those are natural feelings, and feelings are just feelings. I think that was one of the best things we can give our clients, or we can give people we know that are grieving, to know our feelings are just feelings. There's no value to it. It's not better if we're feeling happy or if we're feeling angry. It's what we do with it. It's how we process it. But putting a value will often help us like stay stuck in it, because we add shame to the table and we say, oh my gosh, the fact that I'm feeling that relief, ooh, something really must be wrong. And I can't tell anybody I'm feeling that way. So that's just important to be mindful if you're facing your own grief journey or you're working with people that have lost a loved one. Some of the other physical symptoms can be, like I said, the difficulty concentrating, the remembering things. Sometimes people say, oh no, that's just grief brain. And those of us that have faced trauma, we know the same thing can happen. We have a really hard time organizing information for ourselves. We have a hard time staying on track. We can feel like, oh my gosh, am I going crazy? No, you have trauma and you're grieving. You're not going crazy. It can feel like it. And that's why I think it's key to be with somebody in a clinical setting. When feelings start to become something that you're concerned about, talk to somebody that knows, not just friends. Talk to a skilled grief therapist, somebody that knows what they're facing, knows what's happening. I talked with Dee and Kimberly last night, and we were saying, you know, this population isn't the population to like wing it. It's not the population to say, oh, I'm just going to give it a whirl and see how I do. So keep that in mind if you're a young clinician coming in, you could be working for a large conglomerate hospital system. And it's really common for them to take people to get their hours. And yes, you're getting supervision. You can work at a mental health clinic of a smaller scale. Someone says, oh, you have a traumatic loss coming, I'm going to supervise you. Keep in mind that that's not always the best fit, because what happens one-on-one, your supervisor isn't there to see it. What you report back, you're only seeing what you're seeing and sharing it with your supervisor. So just keep that in mind. Trust that if you don't feel ready, sometimes you're really not. Like once you get out there and you're practicing, it's often to kind of feel like, oh my gosh, I have no idea what I'm doing. But you know, a therapist of 10 years, I still feel like sometimes, oh my gosh, do I even know what I'm doing? But absolutely, because what you do is you face it with evidence-based treatment and you say, okay, we're going to try a little bit of this. Okay, we're going to try a little bit of this. Okay, we're going to try a little bit of this. And then finally something will land that will be beneficial to your client. As long as you're practicing evidence-based treatment and not just, oh, this sounds like a really good idea, then I think you're on the right path. Coping with grief during a pandemic, I think it's really important for us to be aware of what can come up. I'm sorry, my dog. What can come up for us? There's this whole idea of understanding collective grief. Like we are now estimated to be losing 2,000 people a day to COVID in the United States. There's no way that isn't going to affect us, right? We can dose ourselves on it. We could not be super mindful all the time of what's happening in the news, but we're very aware that tens and thousands of people have lost their lives to COVID. And it can kind of feel like Sorry. Sorry, Dee. It can feel like maybe something you felt like you had processed, some trauma, some grief starts to come up for you again. And you think, oh my gosh, maybe I didn't deal with it as well as I thought I did. You likely did, but now the whole planet is going through its own grief process. Not only are we grieving like the death of people we loved, people close to us, but we're grieving the fact that like outside isn't open the way it used to be. We're grieving the fact that maybe we've lost our jobs. We're grieving like not even knowing what 2021 is going to hold. So keep that in mind and trust that. That doesn't mean you haven't done your own work, but allow some grace and compassion for yourself, for the people you work with, and really point that out to those that are within your scope of influence, that this is a really hard time for all of us right now. And we don't say that to say you shouldn't feel bad because everybody's going through it. We say it so people can feel that shared experience. And so that's where that seeking support comes into play. Definitely, if I have a traumatic loss, I'm not going to just wing it on my own. You want to talk to somebody who understands trauma, who can let you know, okay, well, these are some things you can do to be able to sleep better. You want to make sure you can get that peer-based support. I've done a lot of research on the benefits of peer-based support for the traumatically bereaved, and it is life-changing. It's being able to look to a friend and say, hey, I didn't know you before this trauma. I didn't know you before the death of this person that I cared for, but I know you now and you get it. Do they walk the journey the same? No, they do not. But you don't have to start at square one when you're talking to somebody else who knows what it's like to lose a friend or a battle buddy. You don't have to start on page one when you talk to somebody else who's lost a parent, when you talk to somebody who's lost a loved one in COVID. That's how we normalize the experience. And it's important that we move from that grief to mourning. So sorry, you guys. Where we take that grief from the inside and we move it out. Dee, can you take over for a second?
Yes, of course. So I actually want to take some time to ask you all to type in the chat if you are either a mental health provider or a student, or if you're a veteran, or both. Just type, both, or student or provider. We just want to make sure we have a good poll on who our audience is so that we can better tailor our upcoming slides. Thank you so much. And then also, I want to encourage you to post any questions you may have or topics you may want to talk about so that we can come back to them at the end of our slide presentation, and we can kind of have a more conversational, kind of engaging presentation towards the end, okay? I think Zanina's back.
I am. And you know what? We can grieve the fact that we used to have a much more professional environment pre-COVID, right? We can all relate to the fact that we have our kids running in, our dogs barking. It's not the same world, so we have grace with ourselves. And most importantly, we have grace for one another. I'm telling you, I'm doing telehealth now since March. It's been really interesting to see inside the homes of my clients, especially for the little ones I work with. Like, they walk me all around the house. Miss Anita, look what I made. Miss Anita, here's my room. Miss Anita, look at all my toys. And it is, when we embrace it, we embrace the different model, but still meet our clients and the people we love in ways that are proven to work. We know we can make a difference. And I think that if you're somebody that isn't working with the bereaved, if you're somebody that has no intention to work with bereaved, but you came on this webinar to just kind of get some tips. I think for people that aren't working in this field, when you know somebody that is grieving, just hold that space for them. I think that's the most important thing we can do. We can't make it better. We can't bring their loved one back. We can't undo the trauma that they may have faced. We can't undo the fact that they've lost their job. Maybe we can give them resources, but at the end of the day, people just want to know that what they're feeling is being heard and that people aren't trying to rush them out of where they are. And when we do that to people by saying things like, oh, well, at least you have your health, people have died. We're not meeting them where they are. We're saying, I hear you, but I need you to come over here to what I'm saying. So it's important to really just hold that space for them. And we talked about the importance of a trained and skilled grief therapist. There's a lot of wonderful trainings out there. Dr. Alan Wolfelt is one. You can pull out from a nonprofit called Open to Hope Foundation. And if you need to connect with other peers, you'll be able to Google in their site the type of loss that you're grieving, and there's going to be stories and podcasts and television shows from other people where you'll be able to say, oh my gosh, I thought I was alone, and their story is absolutely my story. So just trust that there are people out there that want to help. There are people working in the field such as myself that are eager to also mentor others that want to work in this field. But it's key that you get the people you're working with connected to the skilled support that they deserve, because you may not have the skill. And as interns, we're kind of often just thrown into just see what you have, little anxiety, little depression, little this, little that. But once you're out there working in the field, it's important to understand that we have a duty to ensure that the people we're working with get the best support possible, and trust that if that's not your jam and that's not your population, sure enough, there's somebody out there that they make that their life's work. Again, that peer-based support is so key. You can Google and find so many support groups online now, especially with COVID. I think it's a good idea to think about the importance of creating memories or rituals. Do things to honor those that we loved, especially as we're heading into the holidays. What can we do to not just go on autopilot as we're heading into the holiday season, the end of 2020, the beginning of a new year? What can we do to mark that time? What kind of rituals can we put in place where we say, okay, so I don't want to be all out about the fact that I'm grieving this person perhaps, but I can put their picture out at Christmas. I can have an empty place at the table. I can create, if I'm going to my little bubble of COVID safety and I'm bringing an hors d'oeuvre, maybe I'm going to bring something that was my loved one's favorite thing. And it's just my special way to honor them. And the people that I'm going to see, they don't have to know anything about it. But I think it's important that we remember to have a plan as we're heading into the holidays. Have a plan. Trust if you're doing it alone, you're not the only one. There's many people out there having to face the holidays alone, not just because they lost their loved ones, but because of COVID. And so you're not alone in it, but do those things you know that are going to help you feel better. Reach out to those people that you know are going to have your back. You're going to say, oh yeah, it's a really hard time. I'm alone too. Do you want to jump on Zoom? I'm alone too. Do you want to do New Year's over Zoom? Like whatever it is, there's somebody out there that is sharing your same experience that also needs support. So trust that you're not alone.
And I do want to, so we had a question in the chat, Sunita, that I think it would be good to address now versus towards the end, because I think it's relevant. Yeah. So we had a question that says, is grief always an internal process, or can it be external, or is it that always considered mourning?
Is it, what was the last part of that?
Can it be external, or is that always considered mourning?
That's considered mourning. I think it's like semantics when it comes down to it, but grief and mourning are not synonymous. And we can carry our grief for years. We can have a loss of somebody, a parent, and no one talks to us about it when we're little. No one talks to us about it. We go to social work school and we're like, oh my gosh, I'm grieving. Oh my gosh, I have trauma. Heck, you know, and so that's still grief. There was no mourning, because you never talked about your pain. You just felt it internally. So that mourning, that's where we find that healing. That's where we find momentum in the journey. It's not about forgetting our loved one. It's not about letting go. It's about finding that strength to take another step. And then you take another step. You're never going to forget that your loved one died. You're going to learn to carry it differently. So if you have someone in your life that you know is grieving, don't hesitate to bring up their loved one. They'll tell you if they're not in a position to talk about it. We often will think, oh, I don't want to make them sad. I don't want to remind them. Trust they have not forgotten that their loved one has died. It might be really helpful for them to be able to talk about things that were really meaningful about their loved one. So Mourning, definitely on the outside. And like I said earlier, it can just be journaling. And there's some compelling research that says journaling is about 70% as effective as quality therapy. 70%, that's high. And that's just writing down your feelings. It doesn't even have to be journal prompts. It's just writing down your feelings, because the process of articulating what it is and giving voice to it is where the power comes.
And a follow-up question to that is, so is mourning necessary step to move forward from that grieving?
Absolutely. It absolutely is. And it's never too late. And many of us have experienced, especially when we have trauma, especially in working with veterans and people that don't feel like they have a right to really grieve and mourn. You'll carry that, but it has its reckoning. And anybody who has carried those ghosts of grief can share their story about when it's done being taken for granted, when it's done having alcohol poured on top, having pills poured on top, having food poured on top, having excess work poured on top. It will have its reckoning. But trust, if you've carried it for 30 years, the evidence-based treatment still exists, and you'll be able to integrate that loss in a way that you would have when you were younger. It's just you come at it from a different angle. And that's where those skilled therapists and skilled clinicians and trauma-informed practitioners really come into play.
Thank you, Zanita. I think that was great. Thank you for your questions. We're going to go ahead and move into working with veterans and grief. Zanita mentioned earlier that we're kind of a special population. You know, it's either you gain our trust or you don't. And, you know, that initial visit can make it or break it, to be honest. And that doesn't say that we may never have that relationship, but that just means it may be harder for us to open up about our grief if there is no connection or no culture or knowledge in it. So we wanted to make sure that, well, number one, it is the military caucus. So we wanted to make sure we covered, you know, a military aspect of grief. So a clinical consideration to keep in mind is that there's been a lot of research on, you know, the war and the impact that it has on veterans, right? But it's mainly focused on PTSD, depression, substance abuse or alcohol abuse, and how does it correlate with combat exposure, right? That's what a lot of the research is being focused right now because of our current state, you know, and we're in right now. However, there has been very limited focus on grief among veterans. And I have to tell you, personally, I didn't even know I had experienced losses and that I needed to allow myself to grieve until maybe like 2 or 3 years ago. And that was very eye-opening for me and very freeing, because I learned to, I allowed myself to see my trauma in a different way, where I could put the meaning to it and say, you know what, this was a loss and I'm going to grieve it. And it made a world's difference. So I do want to keep in mind that, you know, want you to keep in mind that as you're working with the veteran population, it's important to consider how they may be experiencing something that they may think is PTSD or depression or something, when in fact is grief that they have not addressed. Veterans, right now we have, it's a total, as of actually December 7th, so a couple of days ago, we had a total of 7,054 deaths in all of our overseas contingency operations. So as you can see, in Iraq is the largest amount of deaths, to 4,431. And then following that, we have Operation New Dawn, and that is 74. And then we have New Dawn. and Operation Enduring Freedom at 2,352. So that's a lot of, when you look at the military population, this is a lot of living veterans that have probably know someone who has died or passed away, or has a connection to someone who has lost a loved one in the military. So to put this into a little bit more of a context, military veterans, we may see suicide as an unexpected, right? And we carry shame, we carry guilt, we carry all of these emotions that we're not necessarily able to process, because we have to remain mission ready, right? We have to still have to show up to formation the next day. We have to go to work, we have to run, we have to follow all of those things. So we don't really process it that well. And then death in combat is expected, right? That's what we signed up for. You knew you were signing basically your life away when you joined the military. And so if somebody dies in combat, it's also seen as heroic, which in some cases, it may play a role into how some families may feel grieving that service member. They may not realize, they may feel less if their loved one died by suicide versus the one that died in combat. And that in itself is a conflict, and it's a compounding grief that it really just grows if not addressed properly. So again, the brotherhood forged in combat is very strong. I served 2 terms in Iraq, so I did 2 12-month deployments to Iraq with the same people, the same unit, and I can tell you that I remember every single little thing, and I will probably will choose the same people that was in my gun truck squad to go back out. Like, I wouldn't want to go back out again with anyone else except them. So that bond is very strong, even stronger than what the one you serve when you're stateside, or and not in harm's way, I guess I could say. There is guilt over the inability to prevent a comrade's death. We will always have that, I was supposed to go on that mission. It was supposed to be me. I could have done this. I could have done better. And so those are all things that I know personally. I was treating them and looking at them as PTSD from my combat and my deployments, and it wasn't the explosion, right? It was who got injured and who we lost at that explosion, and how I never allowed myself to grieve and to actually address that loss, because it's expected, that it is what it is, kind of. And then that can generate anger, you trying to put the blame, and we often put the blame on ourselves, and because we're trying to find out what we could have done differently so that our loved one could still be here with us today. And often so I've been, since the pandemic started, I've been saying that I've been training for this my entire life. Right? Well, really, since I joined the military, because I'm a veteran and I am perfectly fine in my house, away from people. And you mean to tell me that people have to keep their distance now? Like, that's what I've been asking ever since I left the military, right? So what we tend to do the most is that we detach from the civilian world, right? We detach a lot of times from our family, because we may not want to share and go into what's wrong with us. So we kind of shy away from it. But detaching from civilian in the world, it makes it more difficult to cope. So it's an adverse technique that we use for coping. There is something that it's talked about a lot now recently in some studies, and what research has found, which is moral injury. A lot of us deal with moral injury, whether it's because of religion or our cultural background, or just what we saw and what we experienced in combat, right? We don't know what to make of it. we know we signed up for that, but we probably really didn't expect to have to see like dead bodies laying on the side of the road, or even children injured, you know, because that's not who we were there to kind of protect our country from, or women, even pregnant women. So all of that, you know, it really conflicts with our morals, our values, our religion, our spirituality, what we grew up believing was the right thing and the wrong thing to do. And that is something that, you know, we just really we don't have the time to slow down and think about. So I do think that it's very important that when you're working with veterans, you know, you kind of help us slow down our brain, like help us slow down that trauma and how, because we're really good at self-sabotaging, I will tell you. We will make this story up on ourselves, and we will come to see you already diagnosed. I already know what I need. Like, don't tell me anything else, right? But just really taking the time to peel those layers back, it will do wonders. And it will have those light bulb moments to say like, oh my God, I never really thought about it that way. You know, and so it will start to shape. So, and it has, there's a lot of connections there. There's a lot of connection to the brotherhood and everything that I mentioned earlier, but it's completely doable. And we're going to go into an aspect of, you know, working with veterans that is military culture. And I'm going to hand it over to Kimberly to go over that.
Yeah, thank you, Dee. So like we were saying, there's a lot of cultural considerations when working with veterans and military populations. Of course, military culture is the accumulation of knowledge, beliefs, morals, customs, habits, and the capabilities that are acquired by service members and their families through membership of military service. And of course, a lot of times that continues on into the veteran community. And as you can see in this picture here, there are bolded words that kind of jump out at you at first glance, like veteran, courage, service, honor, integrity, valor, you know, all of those big bolded words. But what is less prominent, but I think equally important, are some of the smaller words that describe some of the intersecting identities that our service members might also be holding space for, such as friend, uncle, sister, you know, the branch of service. And on our veteran introductory slide that Dee had, you saw things like religious or spirituality factors, personality, environment, culture, gender, which are all really important elements to one's identity, and definitely something to consider when treating veterans or service members, especially from a holistic perspective. You can go to the next slide. So we often in training, when I do diversity training and inclusion training, I explore implicit biases and perception versus reality. And I commonly reference the importance of the iceberg when perceiving others who we may be connecting with. And this way we're not forgetting the things that make up just the 10% that we see on the outside. And basically the same can be said of the complexities of service members or veterans. Understanding military culture and practicing cultural competence when working with our military and veteran communities is really crucial to building therapeutic relationships and for fostering a healing environment where our veterans feel heard and feel understood. And I know a lot of us are probably military or veteran affiliated, but just, I don't know if you know, when we work with veterans, just knowing the lingo, knowing some of the acronyms and those things are very important to building that therapeutic relationship. And it's very easy to be disengaged with them if you don't take your time to learn those things while working with veterans. So above the waterline here, we have 3 different areas. We have above the waterline, we have the transitional, or like right at the waterline, and then below, where there's like deeply rooted stuff. So above the waterline are aspects of like a culture that are visible or easily seen, maybe easily taught to a clinician or someone working with a veteran. These include things like uniform and rank, medals, salutes, honoring those that are higher ranking, ceremonies, and just services that honor our military and veterans. At the waterline is more of a transitional area where one needs to be more aware and understand how values are emphasized and how they're learned. So at this level of military culture, we find things like the service creeds, the core values, the oaths that we take when we're entering office or when we're entering the military. And then below the waterline are things that are not easily seen. And this is where the most important aspect is of consideration. But they're equally relevant to the things that we see on the outside. So below the surface are things like hidden culture, the more enduring and powerful characteristics of military culture. These things can really impact their worldview, and they're heavily influenced by military or warrior ethos. And those are usually values that veterans hold for life, even after they transition out of the service. And these are things that are often not taught directly to the service members, but they're acquired through their experiences in the military and through their experience with their comrades. So a common theme across military branches are values of loyalty, duty, service, honor, which you see down below, commitment, a high code of behavior, and creeds that carry on after their time in service. But this is important to remember when a service member faces challenges due to failure to meet standards, maybe they feel guilty for a fallen comrade, or they're faced with some betrayal in service, such as the military sexual trauma, or another loss of trust in regards to comrades or leadership. So this is really important to keep in consideration when acknowledging and having compassion for those veterans who may be experiencing loss and grief, because it's often conflicting and it involves complexities of their values and military ethos. And then Dee's going to explain a little bit more about the subcultures that are found in the military.
Yeah, so as I was mentioning earlier, that all the things that a veteran can have conflicts with or have barriers to allowing themselves to grieve, such as officers versus enlisted. They're in themselves, they're two different cultures. They're two different aspects and how their role they play in the military, how they behave, or the rank structure, the role they play in the unit. And in addition to that, then you have gender. That's big. There's a lot of conflict in processing trauma or grieving just from being a female, depending on what the trauma may be, or grieving being a male in a leadership position where you may not want to come across as weak to your fellow service members, right? So that's a very a hard thing to deal with. And I'll share this. My husband, he experienced some tragedies while he was deployed, but I never saw him grieve. I never saw him break because he couldn't, right? He had soldiers looking up to him for strength and for, that confidence of we're all good. So for that, he never allowed himself to grieve and to actually process, he had to be that tough person. You have different cultures between the Reserve, the National Guard, and the Coast Guard. I will say this, I was active duty, but often, we think of them as not full time, this is not what they do every day. So there are disparities there on what environment and what intersectionalities they have back at home to, let's say, when they deploy to a combat zone, right? Because they may have been doctors, they may have been, electricians or some other job, and all of a sudden they find themselves in Iraq. So all of those play a big role in how they were taken out of their environment and placed into something else that, yes, they signed up for, but they weren't really ready for or practicing it every day. And then you have combat versus not combat. There's a lot of conflict in there on people may not feel as worthy enough because the grief they're experiencing did not happen in combat. right? It may not be good enough. You know, we always try to play ourselves down and, you know, say like, oh no, but mine wasn't as bad. You know, so and so had it bad. We always find somebody who had it worse than us, right? And sometimes that can be good, but another times it could be really detrimental to our own healing. And then you have the children and the family aspect of it. We may come home and by not saying anything, we think we're protecting them, but in reality, they're also being affected by it because, you know, we've changed. This is our new normal. And often I mean, I'm just going to say it, the military does not do a good job at taking care of the families. You know, there's this saying that if the military wanted you to have a family, they would have issued it to you. Right? So I'm just going to say it. It says like, if they wanted you to have a girlfriend, they would have issued it to you. So it's often like comes like secondary. And I mean, I'm out of the military, so they can't do anything to me. So I'm just going to say it. But, you know, children and family are the backbone of that individual. So they play a very important role. So, you know, it's important to keep them in mind as you're working with a veteran, you know, kind of find out what the family, you know, dynamics are and how are they processing this trauma or how are they processing the healing. So these are just some of the military subcultures we felt, you know, be important to bring up so that you can kind of get a whole picture of what goes into it. I'm going to go to the next slide, and Kim is going to take over.
Yeah, thank you, Dee. So we wanted to make sure that we talked about or discussed military sexual trauma and grief, especially right now. I don't know if some of you have been following some of the things that were happening in Fort Hood with the Vanessa Guillen case. So we thought this was a really important discussion piece that we should throw in here. As we have learned, grief and loss, you know, they go hand in hand, and it doesn't just have to be a loss of life to go through a stage of grieving. It can be any type of significant loss, such as a military sexual trauma. And oftentimes after a traumatic experience, one can feel a loss of safety, a loss of trust, a loss of innocence. And in grief, you know, having to keep secrets from your unit or from your comrades and battle buddies can really lead to shame and guilt and a really significant, maybe sometimes unresolved grieving period. Survivors sometimes frequently cope in isolation in the military, especially after a military sexual trauma. And even in the literature and research, it doesn't always account for grief and loss as central to their experience of a sexual trauma. It mostly focuses usually on the traumatic experience or maybe the aftermath of post-traumatic stress disorder or other diagnoses that come after a military sexual trauma, but it's less likely to be discussed when it comes to grief. And grief can also come in the loss of family or brotherhood or sisterhood after a sexual trauma. What we know about the military is that there is really strong unit cohesion, and that can really lead to a big impact after a sexual trauma in the service. A type of grief that can happen sometimes is disenfranchised grief. That's a grief that is experienced when a loss is incurred that is not or cannot be openly acknowledged, socially sanctioned, or publicly mourned. And oftentimes when we have service members who have experienced a sexual trauma in the military, they don't have people to talk to. They don't have good, solid coping skills. And it can lead to unresolved triggers, such as what happened with Vanessa Guillen or some of the advocacy that has come out of that Fort Hood situation. A lot of advocates have found themselves in an area where they're experiencing loss again, not just the loss of Vanessa, but also loss of themselves, loss of their career potentially after a sexual trauma, loss of their health, loss of family, or any other types of loss that was resulted from that sexual trauma. And because of the heavy stigma, and like Dee had mentioned, some of the moral injuries that may come out of a military sexual trauma, many survivors are afraid to speak about it, and therefore they leave their grief unresolved, which can develop into additional challenges, like with mental well-being, toxic stress, maladaptive coping strategies, which of course can just further leave that grief unresolved and unacknowledged. You can go ahead and So we also wanted to just kind of give our experiences in context, because Dee and I both are veterans and we both have experienced, grief and loss in the military. So I just wanted to share a little bit about my own personal experience through grief and coping with grief. Before I joined the military, I was a prior foster youth and I was adopted at a pretty young age. So we can already see that some of that left me with some unresolved grief, in regards to my biological family and missing some of those connections. So that's one of the reasons why I joined the military, to find, sense of structure, sense of family, sense of camaraderie, which I did. I found a lot of that early on in basic training. But unfortunately, about 6 months into my service, I was sexually assaulted by a non-commissioned officer. And the consequences of that assault left me in a stuck state, pretty much, complicated grief, that I took a really long time to pull myself out of. I had a traumatic brain injury, a head injury from the assault. So, of course, with all of that experience, I experienced loss of self. I wasn't able to identify that grief. I had no idea that I was even grieving during that period. I had a significant loss of trust in leadership because of the way it was handled or inappropriately handled. Loss of my executive functioning skills with my TBI. So that was a significant loss that at the time when it happened, I didn't even realize that it was a loss that I was experiencing. Um, and also during that time, a lot of my battle buddies or fellow Army soldiers, they stopped talking to me for almost a year. So it was sort of like a secondary loss of family since it was my unit. That was my cohesive unit that I was a part of. So additionally, I was navigating on top of all of that unresolved grief that I was accumulating and it was compounding. I was also navigating a career as a combat medic. So while I was in the service, I was a combat medic. And that kind of left me in a type of grief that I couldn't talk about because it wasn't named. We didn't know that we were grieving for these other battle buddies, basically soldiers, brothers, sisters that were coming into our unit that we triaged and supported. Sometimes we had loss of life during that time as well, and it was so many soldiers that were coming in that we didn't have time to really get to know those patients before they left us there at the hospital when we were overseas. But of course, none of us at that time went through any psychoeducation about grief or loss. We didn't really understand that was something that was happening to us. It was just part of the job duty descriptions. So of course, when I had other military related issues, I was a new mother around that same time. A lot of interpersonal things came up. It was more difficult for me to cope with those subsequent traumas because those losses that I was experiencing were never fully acknowledged and they were definitely never appropriately reflected on or healed. So it's just really important to take note of that. I mean, it took me years before I was able, basically when I started at USC, when I started my military social work degree plan, is when I finally understood what was actually happening during that time, that I was actually experiencing grief, trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder, all those different comorbid type of diagnoses that were happening with my TBI, my PTSD. But that whole foundational thing that I didn't realize I was experiencing until I started my educational journey was that unresolved grief of the loss of myself, my health, right? My sense of trust in the unit. So that just kind of puts things in context. I know we talked a lot about, clinical and cultural competencies. So I just wanted to share that part. And I think Dee is going to share a little bit about her experience in context to what we were training about.
I am gonna just share a little bit because I do want to be respectful of your time. And I know we have like 1 minute, but we did start a few minutes late. So I will be brief. So for me, so I experienced loss when I was deployed in Iraq. It was my first 12-month deployment, and I was actually attending the E5, which is a sergeant's board, to be promoted to E6. and I got a Red Cross message saying that my father was in intensive care and he was really in a coma. All his organs had started failing and he didn't have much time to live. And I was in a combat zone, and I just did not have time to process his death at all. I left Iraq and went back to Arizona and into Mexico and spent a few hours with my dad. And then we were making funeral arrangements. And a few days later, following his burial, I was back in Iraq. So it was because I was born and raised in Mexico. We have certain cultural rituals and things that we do when somebody passes away, and I was not able to do any of those. So there was no closure for me at all in this grief process. And what I had to do is something that Jimmy, I don't know if he's still with us, but Jimmy put in the chat, I had to suck it up and drive on. Like, I had to suck it up and keep going. Why? Because my life depended on. I needed to be focused on our mission. I need to be aware, and I had soldiers underneath me. So for me, that processing that grief, I think I'm still processing it and trying to figure out what to do with it. But that is something that pretty much my military service and my duty to my country kept me from processing. However, like Kim said, it just kept on building on. Later on, one of my battle buddies died by suicide. And I did mention earlier that, suicide, we see it as unexpected. Like, what could I have done better? Should I have answered the phone that night? Should I have stayed with that person? Why didn't I see the signs? So for me, the loss of suicide, I really never, and this is something veterans do a lot. We tend to put ourselves second to everyone else often. So for me, the loss of my battle buddy to suicide, it was hard on me, but then I felt for the family. Like, I wanted to be there for the family. I wanted to make sure that his family was okay. I wanted to make sure that, they knew they had like everything, right? So it wasn't until I started working for TABS, which is Tragedy Assistance Program for Survivors, which is a nonprofit organization that cares for the families of the fallen, that I saw what I thought was PTSD from the trauma of the suicide loss as grief, not PTSD. I didn't feel good enough or worthy enough of being called a survivor. Because I was not family, I was not blood. But we often in the military, is like, we're not blood related, but we're stronger than blood, right? Because we have that bond. So while I was working with survivors, and the survivors, they're so resilient. And if you hear me now, I'm still making the separation. Like, they're so resilient. They're the survivors, right? I'm still working through me allowing myself to be a survivor as well. And actually grieve the loss, that it was unexpected. We will never have the answers as to why. And it's just a hard thing to navigate. So, it is a loss of a person that manifested to me, and but like for Kim, it was a little bit different. And I would tell you that from my Hispanic culture, growing up, being born and raised Mexican, I never saw a loss of a career or a loss of a community or something like that as something that I had to grieve. Because that's just not how we're raised. You only grieve when you lose a person, and that's it. Anything else outside of that is like, what are you talking about? So it wasn't until, like Kim said, I started my social work degree, and all of a sudden all this light bulbs started to come up, like, oh my God, like, what is this, right? And it all started to make sense. And I'm so thankful for this education, but not everybody has this opportunity, and as social workers we have the responsibility to take that into consideration, that not because we they may not see it that way, it's, you know, it's to their fault. You know, it's just our cultural background, our intersectionalities, and where we come from that kind of makes it you know, a little bit more complicated and complex than usual. And our last slide, I know I'm 5 minutes past our time, but we did start, I think, 5 minutes after. I do want to open it, you know, to see if anyone has any questions or any comments or something that you want to share with the group. I know Stephanie had her own experience that, you know, we wanted to make sure we touched up on. So Stephanie, do you want to share?
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Dee. And so what I had discussed with Dee prior to this event starting was how, in discussing with my other classmates in our first year of grad school, we were kind of grieving the loss of being on campus for those of us who applied as on-campus students. We all struggled with not feeling that sense of camaraderie, being able to speak with and get to know our professors on a daily basis, as well as our other classmates. And it wasn't something that we came to realize was grief until we discussed it with our professors and kind of identified it as such. And it's hard because we're trying to be in this field of work that you need a support system, and not really having that and coming to terms with that was something that was very difficult, that I personally didn't even identify as grief.
Yeah, thank you for sharing this. And I'm going to open the floor to anyone else who want to make any comments or have any questions.
Some people wrote some stuff in the chat. If nobody feels like they want to come on, maybe you could read some things from the chat.
Can I say something quick? Sorry.
Oh, yeah, do so.
Sorry about that.
No.
Hi, my name is Jimmy Guevara. I'm actually an alumni from USC as well. I actually graduated from the same program that many of you are going through right now. So congratulations for making it through, especially during a very hard year. So I definitely want to congratulate everyone for that. I think everything that, you know, Dee, Kimberly, and, you know, I started Zanetta for projects was very on point. I feel like everything was mentioned was really like hit the nail right on it. And I want to say thank you, all you for providing this information, especially the military culture portion of it, because it is very important. I currently work right now as a resiliency trainer at UCLA. Yes, I know I went the other way. I apologize for that. But with that, I want to say thank you all. I really do appreciate that. I just wanted to leave that with that. So thank you. Thank you.
I guess I can go and share a little bit. I actually, I was a MSW student at Cal State LA, and I lost my boyfriend to suicide during my first year program. So, you know, going through the grief and then, like you said, suicide and understanding what that meant. And then in a master's program, going through a lot of very similar themes, you know, I cope with it through my support system. So going back with Stephanie, like I always say I couldn't have gone through that without my cohort, without my professors and a skilled therapist who was by my side, you know, throughout the first year of his death. And so I could definitely understand, like when I graduated, I didn't realize I was grieving my cohort as much as I was, because it was such a tremendous part of how I coped with his death. And so I can completely understand how you're grieving, you know, not being on campus and being with your professors, because I felt it as soon as I graduated. And so I definitely feel that certain, like going through grief in our own lives kind of helps us with like having compassion for different kinds of grief, you know, of that they doesn't have to necessarily be a person, but just identity, a life experience. You know, there's so many different ways that we experience loss. And one of my professors had mentioned to me that, like, we're all experts in grief because we all experience it, even if we don't identify it as a loss throughout our entire life. And if we look past our entire life, we've been grieving all our lives. And being able to give ourselves that space to feel the emotions that come with it. But I appreciate everyone's stories, and I really did really learned a lot about, you know, veterans and understanding military culture. So I appreciate both of you sharing.
I just want to say thank you for sharing that too.
I'm just trying to read some of the things on the chat. And a lot of the people in here can relate as a student in the sense of loss with classmates. So yeah, I was telling Stephanie earlier that I registered as a VAC student, right? So for me, nothing changed. However, my nieces are in college too, and they say like they just didn't know how to handle it because that's not what they signed up for, and they felt like they were missing out on something that they wanted to experience. So yeah, so coming to terms as seeing it as a loss and grieving, I think that was very powerful. And if nobody has anything else, I do want to say that we are going to email you guys the slides in the next couple of days, and we did record it so that, you know, you guys can see the recording if you need to later on. So when we send the email with the slides, we will share the link to the recording. Do any of you have any further questions before we break tonight?
I don't have a question. I just have a comment real quick. Hi, I'm Linda. I'm just so grateful that I came across your post on social media. I'm not a USC student, but I am in a master's program in advanced standing at Cal State Long Beach and hope to go. I want to work in bereavement and end of life care. And so I'm just really, really grateful that you opened this up to everyone, even outside of USC. So thank you so much. Very, very grateful to have connected here. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, absolutely. So hopefully this won't be the last, and we hope to continue to share it even outside of USC, because it's social workers, we're such a tight-knit community that even across states and across the nation, you know, we can, you know, support each other and, you know, figuring out the best way to work with our clients or make an impact in our population, which is why we all enter the social work program and the social work role. So I am super thankful that you all are here today, and that, you know, hopefully you guys, you know, take something out of this and can put it into practice, or, you know, with your clients or with yourself. Kim and Sunita, do you guys have any final comments?
I just want to say thank you so much for including me this evening. And if anybody has questions about any of the trainings, I saw that in the chat. I'll definitely provide that information so it can be sent out in the email as well. And I'm sure we'll put our contact information as well. So I love the field of grief and loss. I love social work. And so it's really exciting when I see people wanting to go into social work or wanting to go in grief and loss. So I'm here to support you if there's a way I can.